was it? It's a Visa tablet, and I couldn't use it because I didn't use it. So I do have an iPad. Is it okay? I'll take it off your hand. It's kind of heavy.
Good.
Even though I,
Is that what it is?
yeah, I have an Android phone, but it's still awkward.
Submitted my questions today, so I don't have to start the reading work now. So everyone gets back to me. And do you as a time, so hopefully not until Monday.
Okay.
But
Do you like the names?
They moved the exam up. It used to be over the summer.
Yeah,
Now they make
that's
you
what I was
do
thinking you were doing
Yeah.
early. Okay.
It's we're the first year that we have that done by June 1st. Before it didn't have to be done until like August 1st. But then they didn't like tell us that or change anything else until like the middle of the semester. So now I've got 2 finals while I'm doing my reading exam. Well, normally it'd be like reading exam week, you just take the week off and go home twice.
Yeah.
And now I've got classes still. I'm back in Berkeley in the middle of doing like all of the final grading for TP, which is like that kind of work.
Is the name hard to say in
And
English?
they just have to do it all in 3.
Do you think she would need?
Is it raining more? Let me see.
What?
It wasn't raining that much.
It was raining a decent amount.
Jazz made it. That's what
Yeah, as soon as I like left the hospital, it was like fine, and then it started coming down more and more. It's like,
Was there anything polite to warn you?
I did.
Now, am I right in thinking that everybody who's requested a meeting with me, I've actually met with? Is that a true statement? But is there anyone who would like to meet with me and who has asked me and I haven't actually met with you yet? Okay. Now, there's probably one or two of you who haven't actually asked to meet with me, but it would be a good idea to meet with me. And I've mailed a couple of you. And essentially what I mean by that is, it's my job to make sure that everybody, this class works for everybody. And so the two criteria, because we're getting near to the end of the semester, the two criteria are, have you handed in answers to the mini questions and have you sent in some ideas about the class project? And if you haven't, don't worry, it's not too late, but it would be good for us to chat about that. So, and by the way, if we have already met, that doesn't mean that we can't meet again if you want to. And in fact, also, if you want to send me a preliminary draft of your project, which actually at least one of you has already done, then that's great. There's no obligation whatsoever to do that, but if you want to, then I can try and give you feedback on that. And you can do that as many times as you want in the time provided. So it's not the case that there's a sort of like one-shot attempt. If you want, it's not like one of these exams that you can only take a finite number of times. If you want, you can just keep on sending me drafts until I say this is great, and then you can be confident that it's great. I mean, obviously that's kind of hard to do, but I just I just want people to know that you're very welcome to do that, because at least one person has already sent me a draft, and I've given a few comments on that, and I want to make sure that option is available to everyone so you know it's interested. So we're getting near the end. So this week we're going to start talking about some applications of all the stuff we've learned. Now, of course, just because something has a practical application, that's not necessarily the criterion for is it worth doing. This is sort of like this question: why should you care? You can care because something is just an interesting scientific question. That's actually a very good reason to care. But things having actual real-world applications, I think, is potentially interesting. And it turns out that also raises some interesting, quote-unquote, basic science questions as well about, exactly the kinds of things we've been looking at: representations, structural representations, connectivity, being able to predict something from imaging over and above what you get from behavior. So I've sort of highlighted a couple of examples for that. But just to recap some of the class project things. So like I said, if you would like to meet with me, please ping me. I just want to be clear, is there really nobody who's asked to meet with me who I haven't met with? I think that everyone who's asked to meet with me I've met with, but it's entirely possible that someone's thinking, oh, you haven't met with me yet, and I've asked you 10 times. Okay, well, and there's definitely, even if you haven't asked to meet with me, then hey, why not? I'm happy to. It's my job as well. And there's actually a couple of you who I've said, hey, let's meet. Primarily just because I just want to make sure that you kind of catch up on stuff. So I've actually discussed this in class and have discussed it in person with many of you, but I just want to kind of go over a couple of things. So people often ask, what is the template? Is it NIH format, NSF format, whatever? And the answer is there is no template. The template is make it clear, easy to remember, and say the important stuff first. Which, by the way, is actually the true template of everything else. It's just that, this is the make it stick in the reader's head template, which is actually much more important than any other templates. How long? 6 pages or less. The or less is completely. I would like to emphasize that. You could actually, get the whole thing into a page maybe. In fact, it would actually be probably a lot harder to get the whole thing into a page than it would be into 6 pages. But I'm not kidding about that, because really, the first page is the most important. In fact, the opening sentences, this is why I was getting everyone to do these this exercise of send in your first 3 sentences. Sentence 1, what question you're going to ask. Sentence 2, how you're going to ask it. Sentence 3, why should you care? And that's probably the most important one, the why should you care. So if you've got those first 3 sentences right, with only a very slight exaggeration, you're golden. It doesn't even, don't just fill the remaining 5.5 pages with, Lawrence or something, but that it's, in a perfect world, it wouldn't be the case that the reader's attention, this is not just a statement about me, this is a statement about any time you ever give anybody anything to read. You have their attention when they pick up your piece of paper or open your document or whatever, and after that, their attention will start to fall off. So try and front load it, get the important information in there early. That's an easy thing to say, a really hard thing to do. But one of the things that is, and I've discussed this with many of you as well, is the danger of getting the crucial question, like what question are you going to ask? It feels like you shouldn't make that the first sentence, because everyone always says, oh, start with background and significance. And if you look at the template, and I know I'm just saying stuff I said before, but people think that background means tell me that the brain is an important organ and that human beings are highly adaptable and stuff like that. Well, then there is a sense of background in which, but it really means think of it instead of, so if you have a background section, so for instance, the person who sent me a draft already and I gave some comments, it turned out, it was very good and, nice questions and everything, but I had to get to the middle of page 3 before I actually found what question the person was going to ask. So I said, this is great, but make that your opening sentence. Don't have the first 2 pages. And this is a very, very common thing. It's a big trap, in my opinion. So the first sentence is, I'm going to ask this question. And the background is really, it's not like, here's some stuff. Okay? It should be, hey, that question I told you? Here's why you should care about that question. So it should be very, very specifically about that. And this is partly my personal preference, but I hope and genuinely believe that this will be useful in other domains too, because nobody wants to just get told stuff that they already know. If you do, you're going to take that incredibly precious moment when you have their attention and waste it. And another discussion that I was having with people that I hadn't mentioned before was I said, if you have something important, stick a great big bold-faced headline on it. Okay? So it's not the case that you actually need to have, you're very welcome to have a section head called background and significance, or specific aims or whatever, as long as you think of it in terms of, here's why you should care. But that doesn't mean you're not allowed to have any other section headings. And I think this is actually true, I'm pretty sure this is actually true even in NIH and NSF formats. You can have a little paragraph subheading called something like the key predictions, or how I'm going to test these key predictions, or something like that. Now, because a reader who's really paying attention, if you're writing clearly, will read through this dense block of text, and they'll be able to notice that in the middle of paragraph 6 there are in fact the key predictions. But don't make the reader work to dig that out. That's true for me, that's true for anyone. If you've got the key predictions, have a great big bold-faced headline or subheadline that says the key predictions. You could even put a little red arrow. Look right here if you want. It's actually helpful. Forget the arrow, but the subheading is useful. Okay, so and there's no, and this is true for this project, but it's true for everything. Nobody ever will complain about having a useful subheading pointing them to the key thing to pull out. Okay, so those are some points. And also, I've been asked this. I sort of mentioned this at the beginning of the class, but I haven't been sufficiently clear about this. So how am I grading this? So let me jump to the key bit. If you basically, answer all the mini questions and hand in a project that sort of meets these criteria which we've discussed a lot, I'm completely happy. So that's you can't get better than that in my work. So in my book, so I have no interest whatsoever in failing all but 10% of people in the class or something. I don't think people do in general these days, but anyway. So the project's 50%, and here are the key criteria. This is not anything that you haven't heard before, but so try to ask an interesting question, and the sort of the kind of classic example of a not interesting question is which areas light up for task X. Okay? Now that might be a precursor stage to the interesting question, but it shouldn't really be the question itself. So if you find your project is, I'm interested in some task and I'm going to see which parts of the brain light up for that task, and if you're struggling with how to go beyond that, then we should definitely meet and talk. And this again is not just my personal preference. I think it's the case that the field of fMRI in general is sort of kind of realized, and probably realized quite some time ago. I mean, there are papers of this sort do still come out, but it's really not interesting anymore. If it ever was, they just say this part of the brain lights up for task X. Well, why isn't it interesting? What can you do beyond that? Well, lots of ways. So try and tie it to behavior, try and tie it to some aspects of the way people represent information, try and tie it maybe to the way they learn, just tie it to something. Okay? So, it really depends on what question you're asking, but another way of asking that is, how does this go beyond what's currently known? So in many, many examples, it's already known what brain areas light up for task tasks. If it's a sort of perceptual task, then it's probably one of the primary cortices. If it's a sort of higher level task, it's probably some area near the front of the head. Ask yourself, just how illuminating is it? We gave someone some complicated task and this bit at the front of their head lit up, so now we understand what's going on in their brain when they do that task. Well, not really. We just, if I told you that their knee lit up, it still wouldn't tell you how they did the task either. So this question of how things relate to and extend beyond what's already known is really just, find a recent review paper. We talked a lot about how to find these little PubMed tricks and stuff like that. Find it, read it, see what it says. Usually, I can say with some confidence that whatever question you're asking, it won't be the case that people have pretty much nailed this one and they completely understand it all. There will always be some open questions. This is the brain that we're talking about here. So if your project gives the impression that you've actually, and you don't have to just give the impression, you can very explicitly say, the following recent review article citation, discusses, here's what some open questions are. We're going to concentrate on this one. That would be fine. Convey the key info clearly and straight away. In other words, first sentence of the first page, not the middle of page 3. And really concentrate on, I know I'm repeating myself, but you can't say this often enough. What question you're asking, how you're going to ask it, and why should the reader care? Do not forget the part about why should the reader care. And that's actually a very difficult part, because if you're really immersed in this thing, like say this is related to the research that you're doing if you're a grad student anyway, it's obvious why the reader should care, because I've been working on this stuff for the last 3 years. This is the prime of my life I've been spending doing this stuff. So yeah, I care. But the reader doesn't know that. The reader has no idea why you picked this topic, why people find it interesting, and what it might lead to. So it's difficult to step out of your own shoes and sort of say, hey, suppose, the cliched example is, how would you explain this to, your parents or something, right? That's actually not a bad, although half of you probably your parents are like, professors or something, but even then, they might not be in the same field as you. Okay. The rest of it is the answer to those mini questions I've been sending out. And this is really more or less a function of, did you send in the answers or not? And don't worry if you didn't, it's not too late. So I'm in the process of, kind of sorting through who exactly sent and didn't send what, but you will know from your own mail archive what you did not send, so please have a hunt through that. You don't have to wait till I send you a little list, which I will send actually soon, but you don't need to wait for that, saying, you didn't send in, answers to the following ones. And as you probably noticed at the very beginning of the class, I was sending personalized, detailed comments in response to every single person's mini questions, and that sort of tailed off. So even if you didn't receive, if you send in an answer that's just completely wrong, I will definitely let you know and say, hey, this is wrong. But that actually really hasn't happened, which is very gratifying. The fact that you haven't received detailed comments on the previous answers doesn't mean you have to sort of wait for that before sending in the other answers. You don't need to. You're not going to get the detailed comments unless you sent in an answer that was like completely wrong. In which case I would say, hey, you should take another look at this. So have a look through the, your archived mails for the mini questions, and find out which, if any, you haven't sent in. Most of you sent in all of them. That's great. Some of you haven't sent in all of them. That's okay, because it's still time to send them. And I'll be, I will be sending you a notice of what you have and haven't sent, but don't wait for that. You can send it anyway. And hey, if you send in answers to all the mini questions and you send in a project that sort of meets these criteria, then I couldn't be happier. So so people ask, what's the criterion for, getting a good grade? There's no particular magic or super, super stress test to it. Do this and I'm as happy as I could be. And if you don't, then it will go down accordingly, I guess. Okay, so is that reasonably clear? Yes.
You want these electronically?
Yes, please. However, if your email breaks or something, you can just, write it by hand and give it to me if you want. But yeah, sending it to me by email is going to be the easiest thing, I would imagine. Good question. Mostly, for most of the things, I think you're probably just going to need some text, but you're welcome to put some pictures in. If you end up making a multi-megabyte file, please don't send it to me as an email attachment. Please send it as, like a link or Dropbox link or something. But that's not a big deal. I have a personal allergy to email attachments. That's just me. But if it's just text, it's okay. Yeah, so just email me. Don't send it in some weird format that I can't open. You can send it as plain text, as the body of an email if you want, or a Word doc or whatever you want. Okay. Now, so most of you, I've met with most of you already. I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to meet with you again. Some of you I haven't met with, and there's even some of you I've sort of said hey, I think we should meet. So let's, especially if I did that, let's meet. And that's not me saying I'm gonna tell you off. That's just me saying I would like us to get to the point where you actually have sent in the mini questions, and when you have sent in some thoughts about this and run them by me, and then I can sort of help you through the class, because it's my job to make sure it works for everyone. Okay, so that's enough of that. So so let's talk about examples of pattern recognition and fMRI applied to real-world problem. And I'm going to talk about today dyslexia, because I happen to be interested in dyslexia. But it is kind of an interesting problem just from a societal point of view, even if you're not interested in reading or language or anything like that. Now, like everything else in cognitive neuroscience, it's full of controversy and full of uncertainty. Okay? That's one of the things that makes this area makes cognitive neuroscience kind of fun to think about. It's also one of the things that makes it sometimes very frustrating and difficult to think about. So even the most basic question, like what is dyslexia, there's not actually a single agreed upon answer to that. Okay? But that's not that unusual, because that's true for so many things in cognitive neuroscience. What is, well, for any psychological disorder, I mean, I don't know if you follow this kind of things, but they recently came out with a new edition of what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in Psychiatry, the DSM. They call it DSM-5, I think is the current version. And this is a hugely controversial document. Like, people literally spend their entire careers fighting about this. And it has real implications, because it determines, what gets funded by health insurance companies and how people get treated. But, what is the definition of someone having ADHD or schizophrenia or depression? There is no, there's no blood test that you can just do that says, yeah, you got it, yeah, you don't have it. Because that's even true for non-psychological, non-neurological problems too. There's not even, for many conditions, at what point does somebody go from having a slightly problematic heart to having heart disease? There's not a clear cutoff. So it's kind of like that with dyslexia. There's a lot of debate, but generally speaking, it means that some kid has, this is developmental dyslexia that I'm talking about. There's different types of dyslexia called acquired dyslexia if you get some sort of brain lesion. I'm not talking about that, I should have clarified that. So you have some difficulty in learning to read, and it's something specific to learning to read. So it's not the case that you have a kid who's just generally impaired at everything. Okay? So this would be a kid, very unfortunate kid who would need lots of help, but this would not be a kid with dyslexia. So it's sometimes described as, you know, an unexpected difficulty in learning to read, or, you know, it's sometimes defined as having normal IQ except in reading measures or something like that. But there's a huge amount of debate even just about what the definition is. But it's something such that reading is specifically affected. And there's very famous examples of people who are unbelievably brilliant and successful in many, many areas of life, but who have terrible trouble learning to read. And there's lots of famous and sort of inspiring examples of such people. One famous example, there's a famous lawyer called David Boies, who was like the lawyer who was involved in Bush v. Gore and the Microsoft antitrust trial. He's like probably the best lawyer in the country. He has terrible dyslexia, for example. Okay, how prevalent in it is it? Obviously, this depends on how you define it, but it seems to be approximately 5% of kids, you know, plus or minus 5%. So that's an illustration of how open some of these questions are. So it's a lot of it's a big and real world problem. Now, what actually underlies it? Well, this of course is also controversial, but one thing that's fairly widely agreed upon is that a very important ingredient is this thing called phonological awareness. And you know, that's a jargon term. What it basically means is being able to break the sounds of words down into their subparts and process those parts. So a classic example. So it's very, very difficult for us as normal readers. I mean, I'm just blithely assuming that we're all normal readers, which may not be the case, I apologize. But if you're if you're a normal reader, you just say you learn to read the word cat. Okay, so you learn it's got these parts in it, ka, a, ta. And when you hear the sound cat when someone speaks to you, you can kind of hear that it's made of these parts. It's a little bit hard to describe exactly what that means. So if someone asks you something like, if you take away the ka sound from cat, what do you have? You say at. It's called phoneme deletion. People with dyslexia find this kind of task really hard. It seems in some way that this is actually one of the most discriminative tasks. There's some sense in which they just hear cat as a sort of lumped unit that they can't sort of break down in ways that, you know, people are trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. So phonological awareness is definitely important and definitely has a big role in learning to read and in problems in learning to read. This is one reason, for instance, why books that emphasize rhymes are quite good for learning to read. It's like Dr. Seuss. Okay? What is a rhyme? If you can hear that cat rhymes with mat, right, or hat, okay, why is the cat in the hat? Well, there's 100 reasons why the cat in the hat is a great book. Okay? You know, I have a toddler, so I'm particularly thinking about this, but it is actually a great book. What does it mean to say that the word cat rhymes with hat? It means that you can, I mean, that seems like a weird question because it seems so intuitive and so clear. Well, yeah, of course cat rhymes with hat. But to hear that cat rhymes with hat, you have to be able to notice that you can break them down into their parts and they both have this at bit at the end, and one has ka at the beginning and the other has ha at the beginning. And it's hard to imagine if that seems very natural to you, but to people with dyslexia, that's actually a difficult thing to do. Do any of you actually know the story behind which is another reason why The Cat in the Hat is such a great book for reading? This is actually of interest to people with toddlers. It's always interesting if you study reading. So, some Teachers Association, I think, came up with a list of the most commonly used, I think it was like the most commonly used, like 300 words or something. And they said, can people write a book that only uses these words? And The Cat in the Hat is actually such a book. Okay, it only consists of the most commonly used, I think it's the most common 200 words in the English language. And if you look at some other Dr. Seuss books, they have like much, much longer and more complicated words in them, like the Hornell-Flugel brothers and things like this. Anyway, okay, so it is actually educationally a very interesting book. Okay, there's another theory which is probably related to it, but is probably not, but is probably different as well. This is all controversial. That there's probably some underlying perceptual problems in dyslexia. So for a long time, the classic view was, so this is maybe too low down for you to see, that dyslexia is a very language-specific deficit, and you sort of have this broken language module, whatever that means. And we've discussed a little bit in the class this idea of, are functions in the brain sort of modular or are they distributed? And this is a question that has multiple different ways of approaching it. Something can be a module without it necessarily being the case that it's in a specific location of the brain, although some people there are people, especially at MIT, who think that there really are specific localized modules of the brain that really just do one thing and one thing only. There's a lot of evidence that that many functions are distributed across multiple areas and that any given area is involved in multiple functions. Now there's a certain more abstract sense of module in which doesn't actually conflict with that. You might say, okay, I believe that things are distributed all across the brain, but they're functionally modular, and then it gets more complicated. Okay, we're not going to discuss that, but there is this idea, which was the kind of prevalent idea for a very long time, started to get challenged a bit more in the 90s, I would say, and to some degree in the 80s, that there's actually perceptual deficits. So for instance, there's evidence, this is extremely controversial. I know I'm saying that, but it's impossible to overstate how controversial this stuff is. People have had big fights about this. They're still having big fights about this. So there's evidence from, for example, Wk13 and colleagues and several other people that there might be a deficit in the motion stream. Those of you who went to Sheng Hei's talk yesterday, he was talking a lot about the magno pathway and the parvo pathway in vision. They're sort of anatomically distinct. The magno pathway is involved in things like motion, especially low contrast. There may be some evidence that that's deficient in dyslexics, which if you think about it is really weird, right? Because letters are not low contrast motion objects, right? They're generally speaking high contrast form objects. So then you have to tell a story, well, okay, if there is a magnocellular deficit in dyslexia, which there actually is evidence that there is, at least in some dyslexics, how does that connect to reading? And that's sort of a bit of a question mark. That's one of the reasons why this is controversial. There's also evidence that there may be a deficit in visual attention. You can tell a little bit of a kind of more direct story as to why visual attention would be involved in reading. Andrea Facchetti is one person who's done a lot of that work, but there's others too. In the auditory domain, Paula Talal and colleagues have argued and produced some evidence for the idea that rapid auditory transitions, especially the sort that are involved in, say, the difference between hearing different stop consonants, may be impaired. There's a very interesting theory by a person called Miranda Hissar called the perceptual anchoring hypothesis. Hissar has done some of the most beautiful work in the relation between attention and perceptual learning, and now works a lot on dyslexia. There's lots of theories out there, and it's a bit of a puzzling mess, as is almost every other aspect of the brain that we're trying to study. But despite all these confusions, there is actually some, progress that's being made. And I really want to highlight two papers which I really like a lot. They were on the readings. I didn't send out many questions about them this week because everyone's doing their projects, but I do really encourage you to take a look at these papers. So one of them came out in Science very recently by Bart Burtz and colleagues. His second author, Hans-Op de Beek, is a big multivoxel pattern analysis person, so a lot of work on visual object recognition, does really interesting work. And just for those of you who say undergrads who don't know, if something comes out in Science, that's kind of a big deal. That's like getting a #1 hit in Science. So not everything that's a #1 hit is a great piece of music, but it's at least achieved some prominence. Okay. Now this, in my opinion, has not only achieved some prominence, but I think is also a really good paper. It has a very interesting title: Intact but Less Accessible Phonetic Representations in Adults with Dyslexia. And we're going to look at this in more detail in a bit. But one of the big themes of this class has been, how do you look at representations? So we've been looking at how you can look at the structure of representations, how different representations are more or less similar to each other. One thing you definitely don't get just from seeing that some part of the brain lights up is what's being represented in that part of the brain. But luckily, after having found that it lights up, you can go in and look at the different patterns that are in there, and you can maybe address this question. But then it still leaves an even more interesting and difficult question, which is, okay, there might be a representation, but a representation that's just sort of sitting there that you can't get to it is not a very useful representation. It's like having a wonderful library, but the door to it is locked, right? So, so how on earth can you tell the difference between somebody having a representation, but you can't get to it, versus not having a representation at all? Because from the outside, they might look kind of similar. So remember how, I was saying that one of the, and this is also kind of criterion to think about when you do your project. A good instance, not the only instance, but a good instance of imaging being sort of worthwhile, right, is if you can say, well, people might look the same from outside the head, but they might be different inside the head. From outside the head means what you can get from behavior, inside means what you can get from imaging. So if you have, and I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail later, but if you've got someone who has intact representations that are just inaccessible versus bad representations, from the outside it might be really hard to tell the difference between these two possibilities. All you'll just know is, they're having trouble reading. So this is a nice paper, and this came out in Science recently. Another nice paper that came out a little bit less recently came out in PNAS, which is also a prestigious journal, not as prestigious as Science, but it's still got lots of good stuff in it. Very much asks this question of what can we get beyond what you can just get from behavior. And it asks it in terms of getting extra predictive power. And we'll talk about this more in a bit, but they followed some kids for 2.5 years. It's very, very difficult to do this kind of study. Okay, so it's scientifically interesting and it's practically difficult to do. Right? It takes time and money and effort to follow people for 2.5 years and scan them at the beginning and end. Neural systems, actually I think they just scanned them at the beginning of this one. Neural systems predicting long-term outcome and behavior. And by the way, prediction is a word that's overused a lot. Okay, so prediction often means, and I'm guilty of this myself and other people have been, it gets used this way a lot, means we were able to fit a function to it such that, you might have like a scatter plot with, neural measure here and behavioral measure here, and there's some kind of correlation. You can say, aha, the neural measure predicts the behavioral measure. Well, in a sense, that's a perfectly valid sense of prediction, but you have to be careful about overfitting. I mean, there's tests you can do that, cross-validation. Sometimes people call that post-diction because it's not really prediction. You're not actually forecasting the future. To really do real prediction, you actually literally have to take a measurement at time t and then wait, preferably for quite a long time, and follow people or whatever you're measuring during that time and see, does your measurement at the beginning of time. This is often called a prodromal or a prospective or prognostic, anything with pro at the front of it, meaning like looking forward. That's a real prediction. Okay, so this is actually a real prediction, this one. So that there should be a new word like prediction star or something, meaning we actually followed people over time and really did a real prediction. I mean, that's actually why sometimes they call it prodromal or prognostic. That means like prediction, the real stuff, not the stuff that people often use the word in that sense. So I like these two papers a lot because they sort of emphasize some of the things that that we've been talking about in the class, and as you can tell from the fact they came out in Science and PNAS, I'm not the only person who likes them. This is, they are very good work. So backtracking a bit from those two papers, which we're going to look at in a minute, here's more of a view of sort of what's like the kind of standard canonical view of dyslexia. And I don't mean that as a criticism. This is actually, really, really good work. So one of the most important people in this area is called Sally Shaywitz, also her husband Bennett Shaywitz. They're at Yale. And they actually have a very, very good website, by the way. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I would definitely check out dyslexia.yale.edu. He also has a very good book called Overcoming Dyslexia that if